What happens when a miracle becomes a tragedy? When the greatest gift of life arrives at the most impossible time? Today's story is about a 56-year-old woman whose shocking pregnancy led to a devastating confrontation and a dramatic fight for life in the operating room. It's a journey of heartbreak, a daughter's cruel rejection, and a stranger's promise that would echo for decades. Prepare for a story that will challenge your ideas about family, fate, and the true meaning of motherhood. Brenda and Frank Miller lived a quiet, predictable life in the small town of Havenwood, Ohio. Their days were measured by the changing seasons and the simple rhythm of work and rest. Frank was a mechanic, his hands permanently stained with grease, a man of few words but deep affection for his wife. Brenda found her joy in her sprawling vegetable garden, a patch of earth she nurtured with the same care she had once given her only daughter, Jessica. But Jessica was a world away now, living in a cramped apartment in Cleveland, chasing a life that seemed to have no room for her small-town parents. Their calls had grown shorter, her visits less frequent. Brenda and Frank were settling into their empty nester years, looking forward to a peaceful retirement, never imagining that the greatest storm of their lives was about to break. The late May sun beat down on Brenda's back as she knelt between rows of tomato plants. A sharp, searing pain shot through her lower abdomen, so intense it stole her breath. She gasped, dropping her trowel and pressing a hand to her stomach. This was new. This was frightening. For weeks she had been battling unusual fatigue and a strange swelling in her belly, which she dismissed as the unwelcome signs of aging. But this pain was different. It was an alarm bell. She leaned against a fence post, her heart hammering against her ribs, and waited for the wave of agony to pass. A chilling thought crept into her mind, dark and unwelcome. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. She looked at the cosy little house she shared with Frank, at the life they had built, and a profound fear of losing it all washed over her in a cold, nauseating tide. Frank found her an hour later, sitting pale and shaken on the back porch swing. "Brenda, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, his voice rough with concern. She tried to smile, but her lips trembled. "Just a little dizzy, Frank. The heat, I guess." But Frank knew her better than that. He saw the fear in her eyes. He was a simple man, but he understood the language of his wife's silence. He gently took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. "We're going to see Dr. Evans tomorrow," he stated, not as a suggestion, but as a fact. The local clinic was a small, unassuming building, but it was where their lives would be irrevocably altered. That night, Brenda barely slept, the strange aches in her body a constant nagging reminder that her world was tilting off its axis, and she had no idea where it would land. The clinical smell of antiseptic hung in the air at the Havenwood Community Clinic. Sarah Jenkins, a young physician's assistant who had moved to town to escape the chaos of a big city ER, greeted Brenda with a warm smile. She listened patiently as Brenda described her symptoms, the weight gain, the fatigue, the sudden, sharp pains. Sarah's professional expression remained calm, but her mind was racing through a list of possibilities, most of them grim. She ordered a full panel of blood tests, trying to reassure the anxious woman sitting before her. "Let's not jump to conclusions, Brenda. We'll get some answers and figure this out together," she said, her voice gentle. Brenda nodded, clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. She left the clinic with a handful of lab slips and a heart heavy with dread, preparing herself for the worst news imaginable. 2 days later, the phone rang, shattering the morning quiet in the Miller household. It was Sarah from the clinic. Her voice, usually so bright and cheerful, was laced with an odd mixture of hesitation and disbelief. "Brenda, the results are in. Could you and Frank come down to the clinic this afternoon? I think it's best we discuss this in person." The request sent a fresh spike of panic through Brenda. This was it, the confirmation of her deepest fears. She hung up the phone, her hand trembling. "Frank," she called out, her voice barely a whisper. "We have to go to the clinic. It's about the tests." Frank wiped his hands on a rag, his face a mask of concern. The short drive into town felt like a journey to a final judgment, the familiar streets of Havenwood suddenly looking alien and foreboding. In the small examination room, Sarah Jenkins took a deep breath. She had checked the results 3 times, convinced there had been a mistake. She looked at the middle-aged couple sitting opposite her, their faces etched with anxiety. Brenda. Frank. "There's no easy way to say this," she began, her voice soft. "Your blood work shows. Well, there's nothing wrong with you, Brenda. In fact, everything is perfectly normal for someone in your condition." Brenda frowned in confusion. My condition? Sarah finally met her eyes, a look of sheer astonishment on her own face. "Brenda, you're not sick. You're pregnant." The words hung in the sterile air. Utterly unbelievable. Frank's jaw dropped. Brenda just stared, her mind refusing to process the information. It had to be a joke. A cruel, impossible mistake. A stunned silence filled the room, broken only by the hum of the mini-fridge in the corner. "Pregnant!" Brenda finally choked out, a hysterical laugh bubbling in her throat. "Sarah, I'm 56 years old. I went through menopause years ago. That's impossible." Frank looked from his wife to the young PA, his face ashen. Sarah slid an ultrasound photo across the desk. "I didn't believe it either, so I had the lab run the hormone panels again, and I did a quick ultrasound. Brenda, not only are you pregnant, you're expecting twins." The black and white image showed 2 tiny, flickering shapes. It was undeniable. It was real. Brenda stared at the photo, her world spinning. The fear of a terminal illness was suddenly replaced by a new, more complicated terror. Twins. At her age, the life she and Frank had planned was dissolving before her very eyes. The drive home was silent. Brenda held the ultrasound photo in her lap, her fingers tracing the ghostly outlines of the 2 lives growing inside her. Frank gripped the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the road, but his mind was miles away. How could this happen? What would people say? How would they manage financially and physically? They were supposed to be planning for retirement, not a nursery. When they finally pulled into their driveway, Frank turned off the engine and looked at his wife. He saw the terror in her eyes, but beneath it, he saw something else, a flicker of wonder. He reached over and placed his hand over hers on the photograph. "Well," he said, his voice raspy with emotion, "it looks like our quiet years are officially over." A single tear rolled down Brenda's cheek, a mixture of fear, shock, and a dawning, terrifying joy. As weeks turned into months, a cautious sense of acceptance settled over the Miller house. They decided to keep the news to themselves for as long as possible, a secret shared between the 2 of them. The initial shock gave way to a quiet routine of doctor's appointments and hushed, late-night conversations about names and college funds. Frank started clearing out his old workshop, measuring the space for 2 cribs. Brenda started knitting, her hands moving with a long-forgotten muscle memory, creating tiny blue and pink booties. There were difficult moments, days when the sheer weight of their new reality felt crushing, but in the quiet of their home, a fragile hope began to bloom. They were a team. They would face this together. They had not yet considered the one person whose reaction could shatter their newfound peace, their daughter Jessica. That Sunday, Jessica called. It was a rare, unprompted call that immediately put Brenda on edge. "Hey, Mom, I'm thinking of driving down for the day. Can I?" she asked, her voice uncharacteristically sweet. Brenda's heart leapt and sank at the same time. She hadn't seen Jessica in months, but today, with her belly now noticeably swollen, under a loose-fitting dress, today was the worst possible day. "Of course, honey. We'd love to see you," Brenda said, her voice trembling slightly. As she hung up, a wave of anxiety washed over her. She and Frank exchanged a worried glance. They knew they couldn't hide it anymore. The secret was about to come out, and they both had a terrible feeling about how Jessica would react. They braced themselves, a sense of impending doom hanging heavy in the summer air. Jessica breezed in late that afternoon, tossing her purse onto a chair and barely glancing at her mother. "Hey, Dad," she said, giving Frank a quick, dismissive kiss on the cheek. "Listen, I can't stay long. I need some help. My landlord's raising the rent again, and I'm a little short this month." She finally turned to Brenda. her eyes narrowing as she took in her mother's changed figure. Her casual demeanour vanished, replaced by a cold, hard stare. A slow, incredulous disgust spread across her face. "What is that?" she asked, her voice dripping with contempt as she pointed at Brenda's rounded stomach. "Mom, no, don't tell me. You're not pregnant, are you? At your age? You have got to be kidding me." The words were like sharp, icy shards, piercing the fragile bubble of hope Brenda and Frank had built around themselves. "Don't you dare talk to your mother that way," Frank growled, stepping between them. His face was flushed with anger, but Jessica was relentless. "Oh, and you're just going along with this? Are you both insane?" she shrieked, her voice rising with every word. "You're supposed to be retiring. You should be thinking about your wills, about leaving something for me, not starting all over again. What were you thinking? People are going to laugh at you. I'm going to be a joke." Her tirade was a brutal assault, a storm of selfishness and cruelty. She wasn't just shocked, she was enraged. She saw the babies not as siblings, but as a threat to her financial security, a burden that would inevitably fall to her. Brenda stood frozen, her hands protectively clutching her belly, each venomous word from her daughter, landing like a physical blow. "Who's going to take care of them when you're too old and sick to manage?" Jessica continued, her face twisted with fury. "Me? Is that the plan? You just dump them on me? I have my own life to build. I can't be saddled with your mistake." The word mistake hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Brenda's face went white. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and the world began to tilt. She felt a sudden, violent cramp, a pain far worse than anything she had felt in the garden. It was a white-hot, tearing sensation that ripped a scream from her throat. She stumbled back, clutching the wall for support, her legs giving way. "Frank!" she gasped, her eyes wide with terror. "Something's wrong. Call 911. She slid down the wall, her body trembling uncontrollably as the argument faded into a terrifying roar of pain. Frank's face was a blur of panic as he fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking so badly he could barely dial the numbers. "My wife! She's pregnant! She collapsed!" he yelled into the receiver. Jessica stood by the door, her face pale with shock, her anger momentarily forgotten in the face of the unfolding crisis. The piercing wail of a siren grew closer, a sound that would be forever burned into Frank's memory. Paramedics rushed in, their movements swift and professional. Sarah Jenkins was among them, her face grim as she recognized Brenda. They worked quickly, checking vitals, starting an IV, their voices a calm, steady current in the chaotic storm. As they lifted Brenda onto the gurney, her eyes fluttered open and found Frank's. "I'm sorry," she whispered, a tear tracing a path through the sweat on her temple. Then her eyes rolled back, and she was gone. The ambulance ride to St. Jude's Regional Hospital was a terrifying blur of flashing lights and frantic activity. Sarah worked tirelessly on Brenda, her mind racing. Premature labour, 7 months along, triggered by severe emotional distress. The risks were enormous for both the mother and the babies. Frank followed in his truck, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his mind replaying Jessica's cruel words over and over. He had failed to protect Brenda. He had let this happen. The guilt was a physical weight crushing the air from his lungs. By the time he reached the hospital, they had already rushed Brenda into the emergency operating room. A nurse led him to a small, sterile waiting room, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic and fear. All he could do now was wait, trapped in a nightmare of his own making. Inside the OR, the atmosphere was tense. Dr. Marcus Thorne, a veteran surgeon with greying temples and weary eyes, led the team. "Her blood pressure is plummeting," a nurse shouted over the steady beeping of the heart monitor. "She's going into shock." A young resident, Dr. Kevin Ross, muttered under his breath, "Why would a 56-year-old even do this? It's completely irresponsible." Dr. Thorne shot him a look that could freeze fire. "Right now, Dr. Ross, she is our patient, and we have 3 lives to save." "Focus," he commanded, his voice a low, steely growl. The team moved with practiced efficiency, a ballet of scalpels and clamps under the harsh white light. They were fighting against the clock, against a body that was shutting down under an impossible strain. Brenda's life, and the lives of her unborn children, hung by the thinnest of threads. The C-section was a success, but a hollow one. 2 impossibly small babies, a boy and a girl, were delivered and immediately whisked away to the neonatal intensive care unit. They were alive but fragile. Brenda, however, was not responding. Her body had been pushed beyond its limits. "We're losing her," Dr. Thorne yelled as the heart monitor flatlined, letting out a single piercing, continuous tone. For 20 agonizing minutes they fought to bring her back. They used the defibrillator paddles, administered drugs, did everything in their power, but it was no use. The room fell silent, the only sound the quiet hum of the machines. Dr. Thorne pulled off his mask, his face etched with exhaustion and defeat. "Time of death, 8:42 p.m., he said, his voice heavy. In the chaos of bringing 2 new lives into the world, they had lost one. Dr. Thorne had the grim task of delivering the news. He found Frank pacing the waiting room like a caged animal. He saw the doctor's face and knew. The words that followed were a clinical, detached summary of a life's end. "Hemorrhage. Complications. We did everything we could." Frank heard the words, but they didn't register. He just stared at the doctor, his mind a hollow void. Brenda was gone. The thought was an impossibility, a tear in the fabric of his reality. Then the doctor continued, his tone softening slightly. "Your children, they're alive. A boy and a girl. They're in the NICU. They're fighting. Children, his children, Brenda's children." The news didn't bring joy, only a fresh wave of soul-crushing despair. He had lost his wife and gained 2 fragile strangers he didn't know how to protect. The next blow came from the neonatologist. The babies were premature and their conditions were critical. The girl had a severe congenital heart defect. The doctor gave her a few months to live, at best. The boy had underdeveloped optic nerves. He was almost completely blind. The diagnoses were a death sentence and a life sentence, delivered in the same breath. Frank listened, his body numb, his spirit broken. He stumbled to the NICU and looked through the glass at the 2 tiny infants in their plastic boxes, hooked up to a web of wires and tubes. They were so small, so helpless. They were his, and he felt nothing but a vast, empty chasm where his heart used to be. He saw not a new beginning, but the tragic final chapter of his life with Brenda. Jessica arrived at the hospital hours later, her face a mask of detached curiosity. When Frank, in a monotone voice, told her that her mother was dead and her new siblings were critically ill, she didn't cry. She didn't rage. She simply stared at him, her expression hardening. "I can't," she said, her voice flat and cold. "I can't deal with this. I don't have the money or the time for sick babies." The next morning, she met with the hospital social worker. With the stroke of a pen on a legal document, she relinquished all rights to the children, officially making them wards of the state. She didn't even ask to see them. Then she walked out of the hospital, out of her father's shattered life, and drove back to Cleveland, leaving the wreckage of her family behind her without a single backward glance. Frank Miller broke. The grief, the guilt and the shock were too much for his mind to bear. He returned to the empty house in Havenwood and simply disconnected. He stopped going to work. He stopped answering the phone. When concerned neighbours like Sharon stopped by, he would tell them Brenda was just visiting her sister and would be back soon. He set a place for her at the dinner table every night and spoke to her empty chair. He retreated into a quiet, gentle madness, a world where the last horrible day had never happened. The man who had been a rock, a steady presence, had crumbled into dust, lost in a labyrinth of his own sorrow, unable to even comprehend that he had 2 children fighting for their lives in a hospital an hour away. The funeral for Brenda Miller was a small, sombre affair. The whole town of Havenwood seemed to be there, their faces a sea of sorrow. Jessica did not attend. Frank was there, but he was vacant, greeting people with a pleasant, confused smile, as if at a town picnic. Standing at the back, hidden by an old oak tree, was Sarah Jenkins. The young PA was consumed by a tidal wave of guilt. She had been the first to respond. She had worked on Brenda in the ambulance. Had she missed something? Could she have done more? She watched as they lowered the casket into the ground, and the guilt solidified into a powerful, unshakable resolve. She felt a debt to Brenda, a responsibility to the two infants who had been abandoned by their family and forgotten by their father. She had failed to save the mother. She would not fail the children. Sarah's decision was immediate and absolute. She would adopt them. It was a crazy, impulsive idea. She was single, lived in a small rental apartment, and her salary was modest, but the conviction was a fire in her soul. The day after the funeral, she drove to St. Jude's and marched into the social services office, announcing her intention. The social worker, a tired-looking woman named Mrs. Gable, looked at her over a pair of reading glasses. "Honey, that's not how this works," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "They're in the custody of Child Protective Services. You have to become a licensed foster parent. There are classes, home studies, background checks. It's a long process." Sarah's heart sank. She had expected a fight, but not against a wall of cold, unfeeling bureaucracy. For the next 6 months, Sarah lived a double life. By day, she was the cheerful, competent PA at the Havenwood Clinic. By night, she was a warrior, battling the labyrinthine CPS system. She took the classes, filled out mountains of paperwork, and endured the intrusive home study. All the while, the babies remained in the NICU. She visited them every chance she got, speaking to them through the plastic of their incubators, telling them stories about their mother's beautiful garden. She named them unofficially. The girl with the broken heart she called Hope. The boy who couldn't see the world she called Grace, for the grace that had kept him alive. They were her children in her heart, and she clung to the belief that soon they would be her children in her arms. She refused to believe otherwise. The day finally came when the babies were stable enough to be discharged from the NICU. Sarah's foster license had just been approved. Her heart soared with excitement. She was ready. But when she called Mrs. Gable at CPS, her world came crashing down again. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Miss Jenkins," the social worker said, with a hint of what might have been pity. "The children have already been placed. A pre-approved adoptive family was found. A wonderful couple, very wealthy. They specialise in adopting special needs children. The paperwork is already being finalised." The words were a physical blow. Sarah slumped against the wall, the phone sliding from her numb fingers. After all her fighting, after all her promises, she had lost them. A wealthy, perfect couple had swept in and taken her children. Sarah refused to accept defeat. She found out the names of the adoptive parents, Eleanor and Richard Covington. She drove to their home, a sprawling estate in a wealthy suburb, with a desperate, half-formed plan. A woman with kind eyes and elegant silver hair, Eleanor Covington, opened the door. Sarah, trembling, poured out her entire story about Brenda, the promise at the funeral, the fight with CPS, her love for the children she had named Hope and Grace. She wasn't asking for custody anymore. She knew that was impossible. She was begging just to be a part of their lives. Eleanor listened, her expression unreadable. She saw the raw, desperate love in the young woman's eyes. It was unorthodox, it was strange, but it was undeniably real. She saw not a threat, but an ally. Eleanor and Richard Covington were in their late 50s, their own children long grown. They had dedicated their lives and fortune to giving homes to children the world had deemed broken. They were moved by Sarah's story. They saw her passion and recognised a kindred spirit. "We cannot give you the children, Sarah," Richard said gently, "but we can give you a place beside them. We will need a full-time, live-in nanny with medical training. The position is yours if you want it." It wasn't what Sarah had dreamed of, but it was more than she could have hoped for. It was a lifeline. "Yes," she whispered, tears of relief streaming down her face. "Yes, I want it." She could keep her promise. She would raise Brenda's children, even if she couldn't be their legal mother. Life at the Covington estate was a world away from Havenwood. With their resources, Hope received a series of cutting-edge heart surgeries that, against all odds, repaired her damaged heart. Grace was enrolled in programs for the visually impaired, learning to navigate the world through sound and touch, his fingers dancing over Braille as if born to it. Sarah was there for every milestone. She was the one who held them after surgeries, who taught Grace his letters, who cheered as Hope took her first steps. She was more than a nanny. She was their constant, their rock. Eleanor and Richard were loving parents, but Sarah was the heart of their daily lives. She took them in at night, kissed their scraped knees, and told them stories of a brave woman who had a beautiful garden and loved them more than anything. Years flew by in a blur of school plays, soccer games, and doctor's appointments. The Covingtons officially adopted the children, changing their names legally to Grace and Hope Covington. They were a family, a unique and sprawling one. Sarah never married, never had children of her own. Grace and Hope were her life's work, her entire world. They grew from fragile infants into strong, vibrant children. Hope, with a faint scar down her chest, became a fearless athlete. Grace, with his thick glasses that allowed him to see shapes and colours, became a gifted musician, his fingers finding magic on the piano keys. They called Eleanor and Richard Mom and Dad. But one afternoon, when Hope was 7, she fell and scraped her knee. As Sarah cleaned the wound, Hope looked up at her and said, "Thank you, Mama Sarah." From that day on, she had 2 mothers. 18 years after that tragic night at St. Jude's Hospital, a celebration was being held on the vast, manicured lawn of the Covington estate. It was a high school graduation party. Hope, a star soccer player with a scholarship to a Division I college, laughed with her friends by the pool. Grace, an accomplished pianist, accepted into a prestigious music conservatory, was playing a soft melody on the grand piano in the living room. They were happy, healthy, and on the cusp of brilliant futures. Sarah stood on the patio watching them. Her heart swelled with a fierce, protective love that was almost painful. She was no longer the young, impulsive PA, but a woman whose life had been defined by a promise made at a graveside. Later that evening, as the party wound down, Sarah stood alone, looking up at the star-filled sky. Eleanor came and stood beside her, placing a gentle hand on her arm. "You did it, Sarah," she said softly. "You gave them a wonderful life." Sarah smiled, a genuine, peaceful smile. "We all did." She thought of Brenda, the woman she barely knew but whose legacy she had carried for 18 years. She pictured her in her garden, smiling under the Ohio sun. "I kept my promise, Brenda," she whispered to the night sky. "They're safe, they're happy, and they are so loved." In that moment, the guilt she had carried for so long finally lifted, replaced by a profound sense of peace. She had not saved Brenda, but she had saved her children, and in doing so she had found her own salvation. The story of Brenda, Hope and Grace is a powerful reminder that family isn't always defined by blood, but by love, sacrifice, and unbreakable promises. A moment of unimaginable tragedy blossomed into a lifetime of unexpected joy, all because one person refused to let 2 fragile lives fall through the cracks. It shows us that even in our darkest moments of loss, the seeds of hope can be planted, nurtured by the most unlikely of hands. Thank you so much for joining us on this emotional journey today. If this story touched your heart, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe for more incredible true stories, and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. And now I want to ask you, what is the most powerful promise you have ever made or witnessed?